Somewhere in rural Ireland around 1770, a tenant farmer is salting a barrel of beef. He's not eating it, his family isn't eating it, his neighbours aren't eating it. That barrel is going on a ship, and that ship is going to the Caribbean to feed enslaved people on a sugar plantation. Because the system that connected an Irish farm to a Jamaican plantation wasn't built on hatred, it was built on incentives. And once those incentives were locked in, the food left Ireland whether Irish people were starving or not. This is the story of how Ireland became the larder of the slave trade, and why nobody in the chain could stop it. Here's something that doesn't get taught alongside the history of slavery, but probably should. The Caribbean in the 18th century was some of the most productive agricultural land on the planet, and it was producing almost no food. Not because the soil couldn't support it, because food wasn't the point. The big Caribbean islands like Jamaica, Barbados, Montserrat and San Domingue ran on sugar, tobacco and indigo, all cash crops that made plantation owners wealthy. Every acre of productive land had one job: grow the export crop. Devoting land to cattle or grain wasn't just inefficient, it was irrational. The returns on sugar were so high that it was, in the language of the time, uneconomic for West Indian planters to feed their own enslaved workforce from local production. So you've got tens of thousands of enslaved people doing brutal physical labour, and they need to eat. A lot. And none of that food is being grown locally. Someone has to supply it. The question is, who? You need preserved food, something that can survive a transatlantic crossing without refrigeration. Salted beef, salted pork, butter packed in barrels, dried fish. You need it in volume. You need it reliably. You need it cheap enough that the plantation economics still work. Ireland fits every single one of those criteria. Atlantic-facing ports, a cattle economy already producing at scale. And this is the crucial part, a political and economic structure that, as we'll see, made export more rational than domestic consumption. The destinations were specific. Colonies like Montserrat and Jamaica, French territories like San Domingue, which would later become Haiti. Ireland wasn't feeding one side of the colonial divide, it was feeding both. And the Caribbean colonies didn't accidentally start buying Irish food. They needed a larder. And Ireland, through a combination of geography, agricultural capacity, and, crucially, political circumstance, was built to be it. In many ways, the demand side makes sense. Now the question is, what happened to Ireland that made it so perfectly suited to be the supplier? That answer starts not in Cork or Galway, but in Westminster in London, with a set of laws that quietly closed every other door. So here's the obvious question. If Ireland was producing all this beef, all this butter, all this pork, why wasn't it feeding the Irish? Why were ordinary people going without it in the country that produced all this food? The answer people reach for is moral. Greed, indifference, colonial exploitation. And those things are real, but they are not the mechanism. The mechanism is law and money. And it's more precise and more damning than the moral version. Let's start with the Cattle Acts in 1663 and 1666. England banned the import of live Irish cattle. This was straightforward protectionism. English farmers didn't want Irish competition. But the knock-on effect for Ireland was structural and permanent. If you can't export live cattle to England, you have to do something else with them. The answer was to slaughter and preserve them, salt the beef, barrel the butter, and ship that instead. You now have preserved goods for long-distance markets, which means the Atlantic trade. This is capital-intensive work. It rewards merchants and middlemen who own the processing infrastructure. It does not reward the small tenant farmer who raised the animal. Then the Navigation Acts of 1663 and 1671. These restricted direct Irish trade with the colonies. Colonial goods, sugar, tobacco, had to land in England first. Ireland wasn't a trading partner in the imperial system. It was a provision supplier. Its role was defined by exclusion. But there was one specific carve-out that matters here. The Navigation Acts explicitly permitted the export of servants, horses, and provisions to the colonies. Ireland's legal lane was narrow and deliberate. Feed the empire. Don't trade with it. Now let's add the money layer. In 1729, a pamphleteer named Thomas Prior estimated that over £600,000 in rents were being remitted out of Ireland every year, sent to absentee landlords living in England who owned Irish land but spent nothing in Ireland. That's not a small number. That's capital leaving the economy annually, not circulating, not building, not creating purchasing power for Irish people to buy Irish food. The effect on tenant farmers is direct. You need cash to pay rent. You sell your produce. You sell it to whoever pays. That's the export market, because the domestic market, stripped of its capital by rent extraction, simply cannot compete. But there's one more structural piece. Ireland, unlike England, had almost no yeoman class. Independent farmers of middling wealth who could absorb produce locally and sell it domestically. Production was dominated by middlemen who funneled goods outward. The domestic market wasn't just poor, it was structurally bankrupt. By the mid-1700s, Irish agriculture wasn't orientated towards export because Irish people chose it. It was orientated towards export because every legal and economic incentive pointed that way. Every alternative was either illegal, unprofitable, or both. The trap wasn't set by any single decision. It was assembled over decades. One act of parliament and one absentee rent payment at a time. And once it was set, it was very hard to see from the inside, because every person inside the system was just doing the normal thing. But the numbers, when you actually look at them, are genuinely a bit shocking. We've established the logic and the legal structure. Now let's talk about what was actually on the ships, because this is where the abstract becomes concrete, and the scale of what was moving becomes hard to dismiss. The goods were simple, as we've seen: preserved beef, pork, butter, salted fish. The staple calories of the 18th century Atlantic world. Cheap to produce, easy to barrel, long shelf life. Perfect for a transatlantic crossing. By the quarter century leading up to 1776, transatlantic markets, including North America and the Caribbean, were absorbing 40% of Ireland's beef exports, between 55 and 76% of pork exports, and 14% of butter exports. More than half of Ireland's pork production was leaving the island. For a country with chronic domestic food poverty, that number deserves our attention. And the whole economy was growing around this trade. Total Irish exports rose from £1.3 million in 1740 to £4.9 million in 1790, roughly a fourfold increase in 50 years. The provisions trade wasn't a sideline, it was the engine of the whole economy. But here's another detail that tends to get lost. The cargo wasn't uniform. There was a hierarchy in what got shipped and who it was for. Better cuts of preserved beef and quality butter went to feed white populations, plantation owners, overseers, colonial administrators, soldiers, etc. These were people with purchasing power. Cheaper, lower quality salted fish, herrings mostly, went to enslaved people. The lowest cost calories available shipped in the largest volumes. Ireland wasn't just feeding the Atlantic world, it was feeding it in a racially stratified way, with different products at different price points for different categories of human being. The merchant families running this trade were real, traceable people. The Blakes of Galway sent sons to the West Indies. Henry Blake acquired a plantation on Montserrat in the 1670s and shipped indigo and tobacco back to Ireland. By 1729, 18 of the 30 largest planters on Montserrat were Irish. The Lynches and Kirwans of Galway were active in the same networks. Antoine Walsh, a Nantes-based merchant of Irish descent, built a fortune on slaving voyages and eventually retired to a plantation on San Domingue. The Irish diaspora wasn't peripheral to this system. It was embedded in it at every level, as provision suppliers, as plantation owners, as slave traders. This wasn't a marginal trade or a historical footnote. By the second half of the 18th century, the Atlantic provisions market was the commercial backbone of Irish agriculture. The Irish economy was, in a meaningful structural sense, built around feeding the slave trade. And that was happening at the same time, in the same country, from the same fields, as chronic, severe domestic poverty. That's not a coincidence, it's not an oversight, it's a feature of how the system worked. And that's actually the heart of this story. Here's the thing that should stop us in our tracks. Ireland in the 18th century had chronic, severe domestic poverty, widespread malnutrition, periodic famine conditions, a rural poor who were, by multiple contemporary accounts, among the worst fed people in Western Europe. And simultaneously, from the same fields through the same ports, it was exporting food at scale across the Atlantic. The question isn't how did nobody notice? They noticed. The question is, why couldn't the system correct itself? Jonathan Swift noticed. A modest proposal published in 1729 is the most famous document of Irish poverty from this period, and it's a direct satirical response to the export over people logic. Swift's modest proposal was to eat Irish babies, because at least that would keep the food in the country. And the joke lands because the reality it's describing is so precisely observed. George Berkeley was asking the same questions, but a little more soberly. His Querist, published in 1735 to 1737, is a series of pointed rhetorical questions. Why does Ireland produce so much and consume so little of it? Why are we dependent on imports for things we could make ourselves? Berkeley was a bishop, not a radical. The fact that he was asking these questions tells you how visible the paradox was to anyone paying attention. In 1747, Speaker Henry Boyle, one of the most powerful figures in the Irish political establishment, noted that the Irish consume so little of the commodities which they raise themselves. And again, that's not a critic speaking from outside the system. That's the system observing itself. Ordinary people resisted too. Food riots were real and recurring. Crowds would stop grain carts on the road and force merchants to sell at what they called customary prices. Prices people could actually pay. They weren't stealing, they were asserting a pre-market logic. Food produced here should be available here, at a price people here can afford. But the system had answers to all of this. In 1758, the government introduced bounties on the inland transport of grain to Dublin. The political response to food insecurity was to secure the capital supply, not the rural poors. In 1784, a new corn law subsidised grain exports. The direction of policy was consistently towards more export, not less. And the underlying reason is mechanical, not ideological. The market, as one historian described it, efficiently sucked up the greater part of any surplus for external sale. The domestic poor could simply not pay the prices that Atlantic merchants could. A Caribbean planter buying salted fish to feed his enslaved workforce was backed by sugar profits, one of the most lucrative commodities in the world. An Irish tenant family buying food was backed by nothing. The planter won that price competition every single time. So once you see the incentive structure, the paradox dissolves. It was more rational, in strict market terms anyway, to feed enslaved people in the Caribbean than poor people in Ireland because the Caribbean buyer had cash and the Irish poor did not. Nobody had to be evil for this to happen. The landlord collected rent, the middleman sold to the highest bidder, the merchant shipped to the most profitable market. The planter bought the cheapest available calories for his workforce. Every individual decision was locally reasonable. The aggregate was a catastrophe. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. And that's precisely what made it impossible to fix from the inside. Which raises the final question. What does it take for a system like this to end? So now we've seen all the moving parts. The demand, Caribbean plantations that couldn't feed themselves. The supply, Irish agriculture shaped by law and rent extraction to produce for export. The scale, half of Ireland's pork production crossing the Atlantic. And the paradox, food leaving a country where people were going hungry. Because the external buyer always had more cash than the domestic poor. But the final piece is the one that matters most for understanding how these systems work in general. Why did it take so long to end? What actually ended it? Swift was writing in 1729, Berkeley in 1735, Boyle in 1747. Moral criticism of the system was not absent, it was continuous, and it changed almost nothing, because the people with the political power to change the system were also the people profiting from it. Absentee landlords had no incentive to redirect production towards domestic consumption. Their rents were paid in cash, which came from export sales. Redirecting food to Irish poor people would mean accepting lower prices, which meant lower rents, which meant less money leaving Ireland for English estates. The British government's interest was in a productive, export-orientated Ireland that supplied the empire's needs, not a self-sufficient Ireland that might develop independent economic weight, or worse, start competing with English producers. Every policy intervention, the Corn Laws, the bounties, was calibrated to manage the system, not dismantle it. Food rights were real, but localized. What actually disrupted the system wasn't moral argument, it was structural shocks from the outside. The American Revolution cut off the North American market, a significant portion of Irish provisions exports, and forced a partial reorientation of Irish trade. The loss hurt Irish merchants badly enough that it briefly opened political space for trade reform. And then in 1807, the abolition of the slave trade, and of slavery itself in 1833 to 1838, collapsed the plantation economy that had driven demand for Irish provisions. No enslaved workforce to feed meant no market for cheap salted fish at scale. And then the 1840s, the famine, the moment when internal contradictions of the system became impossible to ignore or sustain politically. Ireland exported food during the famine. This is documented, it is real, and it's the same logic we've been tracing since 1740. The famine wasn't the first time this happened. It was the moment the dynamic became visible enough and catastrophic enough that it could no longer be managed. And one more thing worth sitting with. The merchant families who built wealth on this trade, the Blakes, the Lynches, the Kirwans of Galway, didn't disappear. They became pillars of Irish Catholic merchant societies. The capital they'd already accumulated in the provisions trade didn't evaporate. It transformed into land ownership, political influence, professional dynasties. The money moved. The people who generated it at the bottom of the chain did not. And the reason this matters beyond the 18th century is this. Extractive systems don't end because people inside them recognize the harm. Swift recognized it, Berkeley recognized it, Boyle recognized it. The food kept leaving. These systems end when external demand disappears, when the supply collapses, or when the cost becomes impossible to hide. Moral arguments alone are almost never enough, and the Irish provisions trade is a precise, well-documented case study in exactly why. Ireland wasn't a passive victim of this system, it was also a participant. Its merchants, its middlemen, its diaspora in Nantes and Montserrat, its planters on the Caribbean islands. That complexity is part of the story too. The system didn't just extract from Ireland, it recruited Ireland into the extraction of others. And understanding that, the way colonial systems pull their subjects into complicity, is maybe the most important thing this particular history has to teach. In the middle of this story, we skipped over one or two other events that were a big deal in Irish history. Major events that changed the course of history. Like the time the internal hatred of the system England forced on the Irish erupted into a full-blown revolution. Watch this to see how the empire responded to an existential threat. Bye!